Take it away.
Hello everyone, my name is Tristan, this is Jacob, this is Neff, and this is Will. Today we're talking about the lifestyle of the North and the South. Each of us will be covering a different topic about how they lived and how each aspect of the Civil War affected them. I'm going to be talking about how the Northern Army was fed. Jacob will be talking about food and culture in the South. Neff will be talking about immigration and religion. And Will will be talking about industry and how that affected the lives of the people. Take it away.
Good morning, class. Once again, my name is Jacob. Today I will be talking about the lifestyle in the South in the 1860s, specifically food culture and agriculture. Before the war, the South had a booming agriculture industry. They pretty much grew the world's cotton and tobacco supply. A combo of Union scorched earth campaigns, the end of slavery, and the death of most of the Southern men pretty much brought an end to this industry. The South was also known for some of the best foods in America, but in the 1860s this was not the case. My presentation will take a further look into the struggles of the South. So for agriculture, the South supplied 75% of the world's cotton, and they were producing 500 million pounds of cotton every year. They pretty much led in the production and manufacturing of tobacco. The thing about tobacco, it required a lot of land and manpower, and in 1862 the Confederate Congress started passing laws banning the growth of tobacco and asked farmers to move towards growing food. Factories were turned into war prisons for Union soldiers. There's also instances of Confederate soldiers exchanging tobacco on the battlefield with Union soldiers for goods that couldn't be found in the South. These industries depended on slavery, and with the end of slavery and the destruction of farmland, the South was no longer the leading, they no longer led the world in the production of tobacco and cotton. Food, where it at though? The South had some of the richest fields, and they grew massive amounts of food throughout the 1860s. But they still found it, they were still unable to feed their army of over 750,000 men. The Union figured out a way to starve the South, and they blocked off trade routes along the Atlantic coast and Mississippi River. A combination of insufficient railway systems, nobody to harvest crops, and trade routes cut off left the army eating pretty bad food. Their daily ration was hard bread, corned beef, and veggies, and whatever scraps they could find. The biggest loss that the South took with this blockage was imported salt from Wales, which they pretty much used for everything, most importantly preserving meat. And so then recipes started appearing in periodicals and newspaper, teaching people how to smoke meat like the Indians used to, and pretty much how to cook food with the most basic ingredients. The biggest food change that came out of the Civil War was they started eating peanuts, or goober peas, and this was a really big food change because peanuts were usually only eaten by the lowest class or fed to livestock. And so they would eat peanuts either raw, boiled, roasted, and soldiers even made a paste out of it and mixed it in with milk and sugar for coffee. And there's also a famous peanut song called Goober Peas. Confederate soldiers would sing it like on the battlefield. So cookbooks and recipes. Besides periodicals, there was only one cookbook published during the Civil War. It's called a Confederate Recipe Book, a compilation of over 100 recipes adapted to times. And those were the worst times, most miserably manifested in a recipe about apple pie without apples, and coffee made with acorns and baking fat. In 1865, a book was published about what to do, like how to make a meal out of leftovers. And this really showed the after effects the war had on every family in America. And my personal favorite book that I found wasn't published in the 1860s, but it was written by a freed slave, and it's called What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, and it has some really good recipes in it, like a lot. Like it's like over 200 pages of recipes. In conclusion, daily life in the 1860s was miserable. The South was ill prepared for the Civil War, and the war brought nothing but hardship and destruction. Everybody in America had to adapt to the changing times. Thank you.
So next we'll be talking about how the Northern Army was fed. So even the very basics were in short supply. Stuff like salt, meats, any kind of vegetables were were short in the Union Army. So families would send care packages of food to soldiers fighting because that was the only way a lot of the soldiers would get nutrition and actually good meals to eat, or else they would most likely starve. Salt, like Jacob said, was very important in the Union Army. They had more of it because they were not cut off from their source like the South was. The one huge advantage that the North had over the South was the United States Sanitary Commission, often called the Sanitary by a lot of soldiers. This institution was responsible for keeping the soldiers fed and making sure that they had a steady food supply and that the meals that they were given were enough for them to survive. Not necessarily healthy maybe, but nutritious enough to the point where they could keep fighting and where they could keep fighting until the end of the war. Often the meals that were given to the soldiers by the commission were not enough for the soldiers' diet, so the soldiers were forced to resort to either raiding farms or just foraging through the countryside to find stuff to supplement their diet. One of the most important people of this commission was a man named James M. Sanderson. He was responsible for creating positions in each rank of soldiers that would ensure healthy meals. He created a position called the cook major within each 100 rank within each 100 rank platoon of soldiers. The cook major was responsible for knowing all the basic cooking techniques, how to clean meat so that it was healthy to eat, how to boil water, how to prepare vegetables correctly. And through his efforts, soldiers became a lot more comfortable and they were able to keep on fighting even though the conditions in the war were pretty god-awful. For his efforts, he was named the captain of the office of the Commissary General of Sustenance because after the soldiers were taught the basic cooking techniques, the morale of the soldiers went up and they didn't have the malnutrition that the South had. Some popular food recipes that were around in this time was a kind of bread called hardtack. It was an extremely tough piece of grain that had to be soaked in either grease or hot water in order to eat. But the reason why it was so popular was because it wouldn't go bad really easy, and it could be transported easily very far distances. And then Captain Sanderson's commissary beef stew. It was a meal that was filling and it was really easy to make. So soldiers and the cook majors knew how to make it, and it didn't need a lot to make. In conclusion, the North had an extreme advantage over the South just because of the food that they had and the institutions that they had to keep them safe. Thank you.
Immigration played a main role in the Civil War in the South and Reconstruction in the South. Part of slavery root issues were important in the Civil War. America was immigration and immigration policy. Despite the harmful and violent immigration increased more than 50% from 1845 until 1855. About 3 million immigrants coming to the United States. Almost 90% settled in the north or west, where either jobs or cheap land or both. German farmers intended to settle in the central and upper Midwest by 1860. More than 1.25 million Americans of German descent lived in the United States. Unskilled and semi-skilled immigrants from Ireland, Wales, and Italy settled in urban and industrial areas in New York and New England. Hold on 1 second. My other slides didn't go on it.
It's okay, keep going.
When the Civil War broke out in 1861, American Standing Army consisted of about 17,000 troops, most likely along the west frontier. I don't know, like my other slides didn't come on. Immigrants could find themselves enrolled in a predominantly ethnic, unique in another way. In 1861, most states encouraged local recruiting, allowing hundreds of men from small towns and countries to form their own companies and elect their own officers. Where large immigrant communities existed, new military companies were born. For example, the 9th Ohio Volunteer consisted most entry of German immigrants. Many perceived military experience in Germany. I'm trying to find some more stuff.
All right. My name's William, and as Jacob and Tristan spoke to the food, I'm going to speak to the industrialization of the North, and Neff, of course, spoke about the immigration and the religion slightly on the war. Start off with, the North had a big advantage over the South. It was heavily industrialized, and the South's biggest weakness, of course, being slavery and the heinous act of it, stopped them from innovating and mechanizing the South because they relied on 4 million slave laborers. There was only 9 million people total in the South to begin with. So when they started the war, there was 22 million people in the North, 9 million people in the South, and 5 million of those, of course, are only Southerners. You're not going to get the slaves to fight for you once you kill them. And it was a huge disadvantage. So the South was under a big illusion that they could win the war, and the industrialization of the North was going to provide the sustainment needed to win a war effort, and it was going to provision their war units. As you can see, this is a drawing or similar to what a factory would look like, and it was supposedly off in New Jersey. The next slide brings up their factory workers. And the reason I bring up the population is when the South sent off their 17 to 34-year-old men to go fight the war, the North did the same. But it was 75% of the total population in the South had to participate in the war, while only 50% of the North had to participate. Their women could backfill them in the factories, so their war goods never stopped. They produced 3,200 firearms compared to 100 that the South could produce in the same amount of time. And that's a huge difference when you're trying to sustain a war effort with leather goods, clothing, and everything else. The South had the agriculture and tobacco and cotton, but those aren't war-fighting materials. It's natural raw materials, but the North could turn them into textiles. So clothing, shoes, armor, whatever you needed to fight and continue on with the war. The next picture was, I produced a slide, it's to the shipyard, and it's in a mechanized factory that they had producing, and it, like I said, the North had become mechanized because they didn't count or rely on slave labor, and that's what slowed down the South in their innovation. And this, of course, is a war with all their textile and natural products before they're going to be made into clothes. So they had a much bigger surplus than the South had. I already spoke to the city population of 22 million versus 9 million. This is a picture, oddly enough, of the Library of Congress back in 1865 with Union soldiers. But it shows you the density that the cities of the North had. 9 of the 10 biggest cities were in the North. The only one that the South had that was considered relevant within the 10 biggest was New Orleans at the time. New York at that point had 1 million people already in it, which is already big for a city today. And the reason it's relevant is when you have people focused in that tight of an area, more people can group together and cover each other. So as the husbands went off to war, the women could band together, supply for the children, produce the goods. There was women in Massachusetts that were producing 1,000 shirts every month to send off to the war effort. The South couldn't match that effort, and they were much more sparsely populated. This is a picture of a gathering in Washington, D.C. on the main street. I just thought it was interesting to show you the population and how tightly the cities were built as compared to the South. And this is another rendering of what Charleston was going to look like. It's actually 10 years past the Civil War, so it's after quite a bit of it's been rebuilt. And a picture to give you just some familiarity with how industrialized and close kept the North was. The immigration, as Neff spoke to, was a huge part. Nobody wanted to immigrate to the South because of the slave labor. They didn't want to get enrolled in that or become part of it or somehow do that, so they moved to the North. 65% of the population of the North was from immigrants that had migrated there within the last 10 years. So that made a huge difference in their numbers. This huge migration allowed the North to produce 17 times more cotton and wool textiles, 30 more times the leather products, 20 more times the pig iron, and I'll get to why the pig iron was important. And of course, as I mentioned, the 32 fire 100 arms versus the 100 to the South. The mechanization of farming allowed one farmer to produce 12 times the amount a southern farmer could produce at the same time. And the pig iron, as I mentioned earlier, was important because of the railroad structure. There was 22,000 miles of railroad in the North, as opposed to only 17% of that in the South. Plus, their railway system was old and dilapidated, and the North could focus all their efforts and bring all the warfighting materials to a central point in the battles. Next slide, going on to shortages and transition. The main point to take away from all this industrialization, although the Civil War was bad and killed millions, hundreds of thousands of Americans, it gave a shot in the arm to the industrialization and provided America its next stepping stone. It would become the leading nation by the 1900s, industrialized nation, and led us into warfighting capabilities that nobody else could keep up with. And now for our conclusion, Tristan will follow through. Excuse me, Lucy's here, so we're going to incorporate, I apologize. Wow. You did that.
Okay. So I'm going to be presenting on the consumer goods of the South, in particular the fashion of men and women, as well as the toys produced and the belongings owned by slaves. So, starting with women's fashion, before the war, a lot of women's fashion was made out of cotton, but due to the fact that most of the cotton was grown in the South, but all of the mills and factories and whatnot used to produce it, and clothing with it, was in the North, so cotton clothing fell a little bit out of fashion in the South because it was simply a lot harder to work with by hand. So homespun clothing became more common. Particular women clothing is primarily composed of a large hooped skirt with a lot of rings to keep a very wide hip, a corset that keeps the waist very, very thin, and then it expands again to the upper body, creating a very hourglass figure that was very, very popular among women of the day. For their hats, during the summer, most women would wear wide brimmed hat, like a straw hat, or some sort of other finer material. But during the winter, they would instead change to a bonnet, like you see in the picture there, in order to keep warm, since the South often had both extremes, cold in the winter, hot in the summer. For accessories, they had parasols to keep the sun out of their face and help keep cool, along with paper fans, jewelry, purses, as well as nosegays, which are small bouquets of flowers that they would be held in front of their nose just to help smell nice, since this was a time before deodorant, so it got very smelly. The lower classes wore crinoline cages, which are similar to the hoop skirts you see in that picture, but they just have less hoops, so they're smaller and less expensive. On the male side of things, it was typically it didn't vary very much. Male clothing tended to just be a suit and tie with an overcoat, like you see in the picture there, a brimmed hat, slacks, that sort of thing. The main difference was in materials, so finer materials would be used by upper classes, particularly white undershirts were very popular as a status symbol because it was simply more expensive. Any sort of plaid or stripe pattern was more expensive, since combining different colors is more expensive than using a solid color. Facial hair was very, very common in the South, but full beards typically wasn't, so you'd see a lot of mutton chops, the sort of facial hair you see in that picture. And shoes were, of course, used. They were typically leather. This was around the time where the earliest forms of sneakers started to be introduced. But interestingly, shoes did not have left or right shoes back then. They were simply the same thing, and there were also no half sizes of shoes. Moving on to Southern uniforms used in the war, they started off with relative variety. A lot of Southern soldiers brought simply whatever they had at home, whatever fine uniforms they had. But as time went on, it became very important for both sides to be able to distinguish between each other, since friendly fire was starting to become common. So it sort of became a standard gray among most soldiers, as you can see in the picture there. The main difference was that artillerymen tend to have a red trim throughout their uniform, while cavalrymen, such as the one you see on the left there, tend to have yellow trim instead. So the cotton farms in the South allowed the Southern to sometimes have cotton uniforms. It wasn't incredibly common, since again, it was harder to work with without the mills in the North, but they did have cotton uniforms, whereas the North primarily didn't, since they had no supply of cotton. Moving on to Southern toys, they tend to kind of come in three categories. There were dolls, there were sort of gambling or chance type items like dominoes or dice, and there was musical instruments. Dolls were often hand-knit out of something whatever was at hand, and a lot of toys that are still popular today, like dominoes and the cup and ball toy, still existed back then.